Hello, my mother works in an office and stories like this aren't just video for viewing. These are real pain points that few people talk about. The story isn't just fictional passions, but about experiences that can happen to any woman. Learn about yourself, draw conclusions, and don't repeat other people's mistakes. All names, companies, and addresses here are fictional. Let's go.
Morgan Dalton, how long have you worked here? The CEO's voice cut through the chatter at the offsite, smooth and effortless, like it was just another passing question. I felt every pair of eyes turned toward me. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't flinch. I smiled, just the right kind of smile, the one that didn't give anything away. About 8 years, I replied, keeping it simple. A subtle nod, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, the CEO looked away, his attention already on something else, something more urgent in his mind. I was just another part of the backdrop, another face in the room, another cog in a machine that had been running long before Eric Marston had even set foot in this world. I wasn't someone who grabbed attention. I didn't need to. I had built my world quietly, the steady hum of Adler Supply Co. as it moved forward, inventory synced, carrier routes optimized, delays erased. There was a sense of pride in my work, a satisfaction that didn't need applause. My creation, StrataPath, was exactly that. Nothing flashy, but it worked. It worked better than anything they'd tried before. Shiny platforms came and went, but my system remained seamless and steady in places where the others failed. And yet, despite the years of steady contribution, I had always been invisible. I was never called to the front. I didn't give speeches at town halls or make flashy presentations. I wasn't on the covers of trade magazines. I was the one behind the scenes, keeping the heartbeat of the company alive. That's when Eric Marston stepped in, fresh from his MBA, all-confident speeches, and endless ambition. The CEO's son. He wasn't an outsider. He was family. The next in line. They said it was succession planning, a smooth transition, a new era for Adler. But I knew better. It wasn't planning. It was a power grab. Eric had barely been in the company a year when they started calling it that, succession planning. But I saw it for what it really was. A slow push, a shift of control. The transition was already happening, and it didn't matter that I had been there for 8 years, building systems, solving problems, keeping the whole thing from falling apart. No, what mattered now was Eric's shiny credentials and his vision, a vision that was mostly words and buzzwords. At that offsite, the CEO finally looked at me and asked his question. How long have you been with us? 8 years. In that moment, I felt the weight of those 8 years, all the long hours, the weekends I spent buried in code, the countless problems I'd solved without so much as a thank you. 8 years of quiet contribution, 8 years of being overlooked, and now, a simple question to brush it all aside. I smiled. 8 years. He nodded, his eyes gliding over me as though I were nothing more than a minor detail in the grand scheme of things. Then, without another word, the CEO turned away, walking to the next person in line. Eric Marston didn't even acknowledge my presence. His mind was already elsewhere, moving on to the next topic. But that small, casual nod, that simple acknowledgement, was all I needed to know. I was nothing more than a cog to them, useful when needed, but easily disposable. And when I got the email the next morning, the one that told me I'd be reporting directly to Eric, the new golden child, I knew everything had changed. The subject line read, Strategic Realignment. And in the body of the email? Morgan, we believe your skill set would be best used to support the evolving leadership journey of Eric Marston. Support. Babysit. I didn't care what words they used. It was clear. They had no intention of seeing me as an equal anymore. I wasn't a part of the leadership team anymore. I was just a placeholder, a sidekick to the heir apparent. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, reading and rereading the words. It didn't make me angry. I didn't get upset. I didn't let it show. I simply opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder. It was labeled StrataPath, LLC Terms. Before I'd ever come in-house, I had been a contractor. Adler Supply Co. had hired me to fix their logistical nightmare, and in return, I had given them the key to the whole operation. StrataPath, my creation, my system. But when the company brought me on as an exec, they had never bothered to revisit the licensing. They had never updated the terms. The engine continued to run under a silent contract. The company grew around it. But StrataPath? That was mine. Every module, every line of code, it was all under my control. I didn't have to look at the email again. I didn't have to read it any further. I already knew what I had to do. I wrote my resignation letter that afternoon. No grand speeches, no drama, just a simple, to-the-point statement. I respectfully declined the reassignment. Please consider this my notice. The response was swift. Eric Marston's reply was a brief, almost dismissive, "Best of luck, Morgan." That was it. That was all. By 3:07 a.m. the next morning, my phone started buzzing with calls and emails. The storm was just beginning. I put the phone on silent, and I went back to sleep. The silence was mine now. The silence was my weapon. They had no idea what they had just done. The email sat on my screen, its subject line coldly formal: Strategic Realignment. I read it once, twice. I wasn't angry. I didn't need to be. There was no point in reacting, just the dull, mechanical realization that they had done exactly what I expected. The body of the email was even less surprising. I would now be reporting directly to Eric Marston, the CEO's son, to support the evolving leadership journey. Support. Babysit. Same thing. The words didn't matter. The meaning was clear. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't recognition. It was a demotion disguised as a favor, as though I had been chosen to be his guide, his mentor, an obedient tool for his evolution in leadership. I stared at the screen. There was nothing to do but close the email. Then I opened my desk drawer. There, tucked at the back, was a folder labeled StrataPath, LLC Terms. It had been sitting there, collecting dust, for years now. I pulled it out, flipped it open, and there it was, Clause 11B, a clause I'd quietly tucked into the contract when I first agreed to work with Adler, a clause that had never been revisited. I had been an external contractor when I first joined Adler. They brought me in during a crisis year, tasked with rebuilding the company's logistical core, which had been a complete disaster. In return for my work, I had created StrataPath, a modular optimization engine for inventory syncing and carrier routing, a solution that outperformed anything they had before. But when Adler eventually brought me in-house, they never thought to revisit the licensing agreement. The engine, the core of their operations, everything that made their logistics run smoothly, remained tied to that silent contract. It didn't belong to them. It never had. StrataPath was mine, and it was only licensed to Adler. Non-exclusive, revocable, renewable annually by written consent from Dalton Modular Solutions, LLC. I smiled to myself, almost without realizing it. The company had grown around my system, but they hadn't taken a moment to consider that the core of their operations wasn't truly theirs. It was mine. I had quietly maintained the system's integrity over the years, never drawing attention, never rocking the boat, just doing my job, waiting for the right moment. And now, they had handed me the perfect opportunity. The email from Eric? It was the catalyst. I wasn't just a bystander in their system anymore. I wasn't someone who could be shuffled aside, relegated to supporting the heir apparent. No, they had handed me the keys to everything, because without me, without StrataPath, none of it would work. They didn't even realize it yet, but they had just given me the leverage I needed to rewrite the rules. The irony? They hadn't asked me to hand over the reins. They hadn't thought to renegotiate the terms. They hadn't even checked the paperwork. Eric's assignment, the shifting of power, it had all been done in haste. It was careless. And that carelessness? It would cost them. I closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and leaned back in my chair. No anger, no frustration, just a steady, controlled realization. They had given me exactly what I needed, and they hadn't even known it. No more emotional reactions, no more pleading for recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that my next move would come at the right time, and when it did, I wouldn't need to say a word. I would just walk away, and everything they'd built would fall apart. I didn't waste time. I typed my resignation in under 5 minutes. No grand speech, no elaborate explanation. Just a few simple lines. I respectfully decline the reassignment. Please consider this my notice. I didn't need to argue, to beg for a meeting, or to explain my reasons. They'd made their choice. Now I was making mine. And it was quiet. Controlled. My departure wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was simply the end of a chapter that no longer made sense to be a part of. The email was sent before I could second guess myself. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't care to check my inbox. I didn't care for the pleasantries. This wasn't about Eric or the CEO or anyone else at Adler. This was about me taking back control over my life, over my work, over my system. And that was enough. By the time I hit send, I knew what would come next. The polite responses, the let's talk messages. But I didn't need any of it. Eric's reply was predictable. Best of luck, Morgan. It didn't even register as condescending, just an acknowledgement of my absence that didn't go much beyond formality. That was 2:41 p.m. I closed my laptop, left my office, and walked out. I didn't look back. By 3:07 a.m., my phone began buzzing relentlessly, like a dashboard in a storm. The notifications were endless. Calls, emails, texts. The company had started to feel the weight of my absence. I didn't bother to check them. I didn't need to. I put the phone on silent and went back to sleep. In the stillness of my apartment, I felt the calm that only comes when you've made the right decision. My hands didn't shake. My mind didn't race. I wasn't haunted by what-ifs. I had made my move, and now the world would move around me. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't need validation or recognition. They would soon realize what it meant to lose me. But not today. Today, I would sleep. Tomorrow, I would deal with what came next. By morning, the first ripple of chaos hit. I woke to a stream of notifications flashing across my phone. Emails, texts, and system alerts. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than the usual post-shift issues. But as I scrolled through the updates, the same message appeared again and again. License, check failed, contact provider. My heart didn't race. It didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening. At Adler, StrataPath wasn't just a tool. It was the backbone of their entire logistics operation, the core that kept everything running smoothly, from inventory syncing to the optimization of delivery routes. Without it, nothing moved. And now, everything was frozen. The delivery orders weren't syncing. Fulfillment queues were in gridlock. The auto route optimizer, the one thing that ensured their trucks were always on time, always taking the best route, had returned that simple error message. License check failed, contact provider. Eric thought it was a glitch, a bug in the system, he said. No big deal. It tried a restart, checked the cables, rebooted the server, but the error didn't disappear. And that's when the calls started. The VP of Compliance was the first to flag it. He dug into the deployment logs, searching for something that could explain why the system had crashed so suddenly. That's when he found it, hidden in the fine print of the system's log files. A clause. It wasn't something anyone had ever bothered to review, not even after all these years. It was buried deep in the logs, easy to overlook. But there it was. Clause 11b. It clearly stated that the scheduling core, the very heart of StrataPath, required recurring validation from a third-party credential. Mine. I had built it in from the very beginning, a simple safeguard to ensure that my system would remain protected from unauthorized changes. And now, without my authorization, it wouldn't run. No one had bothered to renew the license. No one had thought to check. Eric's voice crackled through my phone minutes later, trying to sound calm. It's just a system bug, right? A fluke? I didn't answer. There was no point in responding. Instead, I let the silence stretch. And then, a series of alarms began to blare in their corporate systems. The fulfillment centers went quiet. Warehouses full of inventory sat untouched. Trucks that were supposed to be on their way to clients were idle, waiting for the orders to be synced. The ripple effects hit fast. The CEO's first reaction? It's just growing pains. We're expanding. We knew this would happen. He waved it off as though it were a minor glitch, something that would fix itself after a few tweaks. But the truth was far uglier. The arrogance that had guided their every decision, the belief that they could push forward without fully understanding the systems that kept the operation alive, was finally cracking. And with it, the calm facade they had built around their operations began to disintegrate. I sat back in my chair, watching the notifications roll in. Clients were calling now, furious calls from every direction. They wanted answers. They needed their deliveries. They needed their products. But all Adler had to offer were excuses and promises that the problem would be fixed. But the truth was clear. Without Stratapath, without my system running the core operations, they were helpless. The company's entire logistical framework was crumbling, and they couldn't even see the problem for what it was. Their blind spot had finally caught up with them, and it wasn't going away. I didn't need to make a single move. I had already won. The calls from legal started shortly after the VP of Compliance flagged the issue. It wasn't a long conversation. They had found the clause. Clause 11B. It had been there all along, buried in the contract I'd signed years ago when I first built Stratapath for Adler. The clause I'd archived, tucked away in a folder that no one had thought to revisit. It clearly stated that the core scheduling system, the very engine that ran Adler's logistics, was under a non-exclusive, revocable license, one that had to be renewed annually by written consent from Dalton Modular Solutions, LLC. No transfer, no assignment, no permanent sale of intellectual property. The clause was simple, uncomplicated. It wasn't a trick or a loophole. It was just a reminder that Stratapath had never truly belonged to Adler. Not in the way they thought it did. They had never truly owned it. And without the sign-off, the renewal, Stratapath wouldn't run. It was as simple as that. I could hear the confusion in their voices, even over the phone. They hadn't realized. They hadn't even checked the terms when they reassigned me, when they pushed me aside and decided to let Eric take over. They hadn't thought to look at the fine print, the small details that weren't part of the big picture they were too busy constructing. They had moved too fast. They had underestimated me. But the best part? The part that made this whole situation even sweeter? Their last renewal? It had lapsed. The week before my reassignment. The timing was perfect. Almost poetic, really. I didn't need to be there. I didn't need to lift a finger. The system's collapse was already grounded in something far stronger than my resignation. It was legally irreversible. They couldn't fix it, no matter how hard they tried. The engine they relied on, the backbone of their operation, was now a dead weight, and the only person who could bring it back to life was me. But they had already burned that bridge. I didn't need to gloat. There was no need for theatrics, no need to send a pointed email or make a dramatic phone call. I let them unravel, let the system fail, let them realize that all their expansions, all their plans, all their succession strategies had been built on an illusion of control. The clause that had been tucked away in a drawer for years, the clause they hadn't bothered to check, clause 11B, was the key to everything. And now they couldn't do a thing about it. The whispers started almost immediately. By the time I checked my email the next morning, the blame had already been shifted. Eric Marston, in a desperate attempt to protect himself, was quick to cast me as the villain. He told the exec team that I'd deliberately timed a shutdown, that I'd set the company up for failure as I walked out. He didn't call it an accident. He called it sabotage. The words felt absurd, but not surprising. He couldn't admit that it was his own arrogance, his own failure to understand the systems he was now in charge of, that had caused the collapse. Instead, he painted me as the villain, the one who had crippled the company on the way out. I had expected it, of course. What else would he do? Admitting the truth, that this was all a result of their own oversight, their negligence, was far too damaging for someone trying to step into power. It was easier to turn me into the scapegoat, to make me the enemy. But what he didn't expect was legal. The VP of Compliance stepped in, his voice clear and sharp. You reassigned him to a non-operational role and failed to secure the license. This is breach by omission, not malice. There was no argument after that. The truth was right there, laid bare in the logs, in the contract, in the terms they hadn't bothered to check. It was a simple oversight, a failure of due diligence, nothing more, nothing less. No sabotage, no malice, just ignorance. Eric hesitated. His plan to shift the blame had failed, but he wasn't done. That night, I received an email from him. The tone had shifted, no longer accusatory, but pleading. Let's be adults. What do you want? He asked. He wanted a resolution. He wanted me to engage. He wanted me to play nice. He wanted me to give him an out. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer. There was no need for me to answer. I had already said everything that needed to be said with my resignation. Now I let the lawyers handle it. Let Eric stew in his own panic. Let him deal with the mess he had created. Let him drown in his own chaos. There was nothing more for me to say. I had no intention of getting dragged into his drama. The silence would be my answer. The silence would tighten the noose around his neck. He had failed. And now he would have to live with the consequences. I didn't need to point it out. I didn't need to rub it in. I had already walked away, and in that silence, I had won. 2 days later, I got a call. It was early morning. My phone buzzed on the table beside my coffee mug, interrupting the quiet. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code wasn't. It was Ferris Cargo Tech, the kind of company Adler used to look down on, dismissing them as trying to punch above their weight. They were a smaller player in the logistics game, but they had guts, ambition, and a hunger for something more. The voice on the other end was steady, professional. The COO of Ferris Cargo Tech. "You built Stratapath, didn't you?" he asked, his tone direct, like he already knew the answer. I wasn't surprised. Word had gotten out. Ferris was in the middle of a national RFP, high stakes, a huge opportunity. They needed a reliable backbone for their logistics operation, something strong enough to handle the complexity of their growing business. And suddenly, Stratapath wasn't just useful, it was critical. The very thing that Adler had dismissed, that Eric had thought of as nothing more than a growing pain, was now the linchpin for someone else's success. I didn't hesitate. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or unnecessary small talk. I got straight to the point. "I can offer you a licensing agreement," I said, keeping my voice calm. 3.2 milers for a 3-year license, plus a consulting retainer. You'll have full autonomy over the system. No limitations. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning as he processed the offer. "Full autonomy?" he asked, confirming what he had heard. "Full autonomy. No strings attached. Just a system that works." I wasn't here for revenge. I wasn't out to make them pay. That wasn't the point. The point was simple. Value. Ferris needed a solution, and I had it. And as much as Adler had dismissed me, Ferris understood my worth. They understood what Stratapath could do, and they were willing to pay for it. I didn't have to fight for recognition. I didn't need to throw a tantrum or send a message. I just offered value, and in doing so, I had the power to shape my own future. The COO agreed without hesitation. He didn't ask for discounts or to haggle over the terms. He understood that what I was offering wasn't just a system. It was a key to unlocking their next level of success. A few minutes later, I ended the call. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the decision settling in. I wasn't retaliating. I wasn't out for some dramatic payback. I was simply reallocating my resources, my skills, my system, my knowledge, to a company that saw its value. In that one call, everything had shifted. I had reinvested in my own future, in my own worth. And Adler? They would continue to flounder without realizing what they had lost. By Friday, the boardroom at Adler Supply Co.'s was in full disarray. The emails, the missed deadlines, the pressure from irate clients, it all culminated in an emergency session that couldn't be postponed. The founder, now semi-retired, joined the meeting via video, his face stern as he listened to legal lay out the facts, one by one. The system core was never assigned. Legal began, their voice steady, almost too calm. The license for Stratapath had expired. The reassignment of Mr. Dalton triggered a breach, and the operational halt that followed violated multiple service-level agreements. There was no hiding the truth. Not anymore. The breach was undeniable. The system failure wasn't some isolated glitch. It was the result of the decision they had made weeks ago, the one that had pushed me out of the company, the one that had underestimated the foundational role I played in their operations. They had thought I was disposable. The silence that followed the presentation was palpable. Then came the question. Who reassigned Mr. Dalton? The voice came from the founder, his tone measured but firm. Eric hesitated. He faltered, trying to gather the words, but there was no escaping the weight of his responsibility. The board shifted uncomfortably, and the founder didn't wait long. "You don't reward ignorance," he said, the words biting through the room. "You correct it." In that moment, Eric's fate was sealed. The founder knew the truth. The board knew the truth. Eric had failed to understand the intricacies of the business, and his arrogance had cost them everything. The boardroom fell into a quiet murmur as Eric was quietly removed from the leadership structure. The founder's decision was swift, his disappointment clear, and in the chaos that followed, the emails started flooding in. Within the hour, I received an email from Adler's HR department, polite, formal, and as expected. "We'd like to explore a license reinstatement," it read. "Please let us know how you'd like to proceed." I didn't reply right away. There was no need to rush. Instead, I took a moment to savor the calm that had settled over me. Finally, I responded with a single line: "Please route all future communication through counsel." There was no need to engage further. They had made their bed. Now they would have to lie in it. In that moment, I knew I had already won. I didn't have to ask for anything. I didn't need to gloat or make demands. My silence spoke louder than any words could. Adler's downfall had unfolded from a single underestimated decision, one they would soon regret. I didn't need to lift a finger. The weight of their mistake was already bearing down on them. By Monday, Ferris Cargo Tech issued a press release. It wasn't a flashy announcement or a headline-grabbing statement. It wasn't designed to draw attention. It was just a quiet line. Morgan Dalton joins as systems advisor, licensing lead. No fanfare, no exclusive or groundbreaking claims. Just a simple acknowledgement of my new role. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to inflate the narrative. They understood the value of silence. And in their quiet, understated way, they gave me exactly what I wanted: autonomy. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I didn't need to make a show of it. There was no Twitter post, no celebratory email. I didn't announce my win to the world. It wasn't about that. It was about the work. The quiet triumph that came from knowing my system, StrataPath, was now at the heart of a new company, one that understood its worth. But the real victory, the one that would play out in the long term, was the one that Adler would slowly come to realize. When Adler's systems came back online, it wasn't under their banner anymore. It wasn't Adler Supply Co. or StrataPath in its old form. It was StrataPath Licensed Platform, Dalton LLC, my system, my license, my terms. And Clause 11B? It was still there. Still active, still binding, still mine. The whole time, I hadn't had to lift a finger. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't demanded anything. I simply held the core, the foundation of their operation, and let time handle the rest. Adler's systems were up and running again. But now, every transaction, every update, every process was operating under my terms. I was in control, without lifting a finger, without any grand gestures. I had no need to prove anything to anyone. My work spoke for itself. My control was quiet, methodical, and it would stay that way. They would come to see it eventually. They would come to realize that their biggest mistake had been assuming I could be replaced, that I could be ignored. And when they did, I would be the one still standing, quietly holding the keys to everything they'd tried to take.
진이야, 우리 오라 누나 출발하면 우리 거제로 학궁시장으로 튈까? 어서와 초근이. 딸기 팔아요.